I've mentioned in past videos that I'm a big fan of the Monster Hunter series of games. I got on board with Monster Hunter 3 Ultimate back on my Wii U and honed my skills as the series moved forward. So I guess it's time to put my money where my mouth is and actually talk about one right here. So, keeping with this theme of spin-offs, we're going to be taking a look at a fairly recent sequel to a spin-off installment of the Mon franchise. There's a lot to break down, so let's just get right to it. Join me for a closer look at Monster Hunter Stories 2: Wings of Ruin. Greetings everyone, this is the Hipster Snek, and today we're going to be looking at Capcom and Marvelous's 2021 release, Monster Hunter Stories 2, which I shall abbreviate as Stories 2 going forward. Being a sequel of a spin-off, I can tell you that you don't need to know much about the lore of Mon proper, nor even the plot of the first Stories game in order to dive on in. While events from those are mentioned in passing, they aren't the foundation for the new story. Instead, we start off on a remote island village of writers, whose culture seems to be a bit more widespread than it was implied to be in the first game, but hey, whatever. Right, guess I should define my terms here a bit. See, Monster Hunter, as a universe, takes place in a post-apocalypse scenario, after a series of events known as the Great Wyvern Wars essentially reduced all to scorched earth, and high technology was, by and large, lost and, in part, retained. This results in large towns and cities with full-on airships and docks and complex infrastructure, but the most advanced firearm in the world is still comparable to an upscaled puckle gun. Look it up, it's a real thing. Anyway, part of what makes Mon World's economy and infrastructure so interesting is the presence of, well, monsters. What makes a monster and not just another animal seems to be up for debate, but the point is the bones, fangs, scales, claws, and other various body parts are simply better than materials such as iron, steel, or bronze. Thus, buildings, tools, and yes, weapons and armor are made out of the parts of these strange creatures, who seem to both influence nature and be influenced by it in turn. Almost like there's a deep and nuanced message about striking the best balance between the natural world and human civilization, and the resulting give-and-take exchange between the two that's actually fairly complex, and not, just another Hayao Miyazaki film about how we'd be better off living in trees and eating moss, but I digress. But the problem is, monsters are, well, monstrous. And just one getting out of line can cause massive ecological panic and a domino effect. Thus, the Guild, a worldwide organization that one might suspect of being the final big bad evil guy in one of these installments, but actually is always on the up and up surprisingly, helps regulate hunters. Those who, well, hunt down and or slay and or capture monsters. Hence the title, Monster Hunter. Meanwhile, in more remote regions of the world, some small tribes discovered a special rock called Kinship Stones, and while used on a monster's egg just as it's hatching, some species of monsters can be domesticated. In these civilizations, the role of hunter is unheard of, and those who protect and regulate these ecological imbalances are known as the Monster Riders, able to police monsters by bringing to force monsters of their own, loyal to their human counterparts. This clash of cultures is a key element of the first Mon stories back on the 3DS, but remains relevant throughout today's installment as well. And with this long-winded preamble out of the way, we can finally get on to today's game and its story. Or stories, I suppose. And we begin in our little remote village island as our writer is coming of age. We team up with a local writer who gives us our first partner monster. Oh, by the way, the game calls domesticated monsters monsties, and yes, that term is very cute, but I don't like it very much, so I'm just going to continue calling them monsters regardless. Anyway, the starting monster is just a Velocidrome, so it's nothing to get too excited about, but the game gets started nonetheless. Not long after we begin our life as a writer, we suddenly witness a massive exodus of Rathalos taking to the sky, seemingly all headed the same direction. For some reason, it's just Rathalos, no Rathians are actually shown during these events, just thinking out loud. Right after, hunters are on the prowl for a Wyverian girl, and oh yeah, there are elves in Monster Hunter. They're called Wyverians, and they're basically humans, but better for some reason. I really hate fantasy elves. Anyway, the girl, Enna, throws in with us, and we're set out for the mainland, hoping to find out what caused a mysterious shift in the natural order of things. Conveniently, this is actually where the demo in Chapter 1 ends, so you're free to take the demo for a whirl and decide if the game's for you. More on that later. To begin with, the game looks good. It aims for a bright, pastel, anime-esque look to contrast with the more realistic direction that Mon proper has been taking in its recent installments, which works well given the younger age of our protag in this game, which we get to make in the usual and somewhat restrictive Mon tradition. The monsters are generally scaled down, in part due to this being a turn-based RPG, and things could get really out of hand if your monster was that much bigger than its environment. But honestly, it all looks good in this sort of super deformed sense. I mean, I love my Gravios throughout my playthrough, but if he was true to scale, I wouldn't be able to even see the encounters on the map, so this makes sense in execution. And the weapons look great too. And unlike some Monster Hunter worlds I could be ribbing right now, they actually change shape depending on what the weapons actually are and are made of. I know this is an aesthetic quibble, but just let me have this. Anyway, the music's great. It's a Capcom game, so of course. Be it peaceful, relaxed sound themes or the larger-than-life battle anthems, the Monster Hunter games have always had an amazing OST, and Stories 2 is certainly no exception. The voice cast does a really great job as well, even if Ina's voice is kind of strange coming out of that frame, but hey, whatever, she pours her heart into it, no complaints here. The monster roars are all faithfully recreated here for authenticity, and it sounds great. Love the work the sound team does on these games, I gotta say. And sound effects are overall mostly borrowed from Monhun proper for continuity's sake, like the classic item get soundbite reprises its use in this game as well. All in all, good stuff. So, now to break down the mechanical side of things. Fundamentally, Stories 2 is a turn-based RPG with some puzzle elements peppered in. You're always in a party with one writer and one monster, and for some plot-relevant moments you'll be accompanied by some story-specific help. Sometimes this takes the form of another writer and their monster, or sometimes even a hunter who forgoes use of the monster partner in return for a roster of abilities unique to them. However, helpers or no helpers, the only person you give commands to is your human writer character. That's because your helpers, monsters and other humans alike, abide by a basic AI pattern with strong proclivities towards certain routines. Why does this matter? That's because the game's primary attack system hinges on a rock, paper, scissors style of gameplay, with attacks coming in power, speed, and technique flavors, each color-coded for your convenience. Speed techniques will beat power, power beats technique, and technique beats speed. Simple, right? Well, while you can pick any of these you want, your friends are all going to lean into their own preferences, as will the enemies. This leads to a very important core mechanic, the head-to-head clashes. While turns are executed by order of the highest speed stat, if two targets are aiming at each other, they engage in a head-to-head, which is where the nature of the rock, paper, scissors triangle mentioned before will come into play, with dramatically more damage being dealt to the loser of the exchange. Now, where it gets even better is if both you and your monster are in perfect sync and both throw advantageously over the same target. You'll engage in a double attack, which completely negates your enemy's attack and strikes them with an overpowering force that greatly fills your kinship or special move gauge. See, your special techniques, both those of yours and your monsters, cast from a shared kinship gauge, including the ability to ride on your monster's back. Not only does doing this greatly restore HP to both rider and monster, it will also facilitate the kinship attack, which is a huge non-affinity attack that overwhelms enemies in different ways, varying by the species of your monster partner. Not only that, but weapons play a large role as well, and this is kind of a small gripe I have with the game. There's only 6 weapon families of all available weapons in the Monhun universe. See, confession, I'm a Switch Axe main in the Monhun franchise proper, but you can't get those in stories. Only Greatsword, Sword and Shield, Gun, Lance, Bow, Hammer, and Hunting Horn. The idea being that weapons fall into different categories of slashing, stabbing, and bashing damage types, each doing a level of effectiveness against different monsters and their various body parts, something that is translated from the core series, which is really cool to see. But the problem is the game definitely has its favorites. If you want to rock a gun lance, you're going to be hurting for options until mid and late game. Anyway, the idea between the 6 choices is that one weapon is more offensively minded, those being Greatsword, Bow, and Hammer, and the other 3 tend to be more defense-oriented, Sword and Shield, Gun, Lance, and Hunting Horn, and you can carry any 3 you want at any time and even swap between them as a free action once per turn. In similar fashion, you can also keep 6 monsters with you and rotate them out as you require them in similar fashion once per turn for free, though one slot will always be taken up by the story-mandated Rathalos, though it's a Rathalos, what are you complaining about? So the key to winning any given encounter is quickly reasoning out what the enemy monster's patterns are, and then adapting with your weapons, your monsters, and to a lesser extent, elemental alignment of each. Especially as some can enter a furiously enraged state, which can shake up their proclivities for the duration. So most battles are determined by you learning the enemy's quirks and setting up your team to counter, ideally shutting down most of their attacks via your double attacks and blasting their health away using your kinship powers as finisher. But wait, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, aren't we? We need to get some monsters. Every time we enter an action field, both monster encounters and nests are spawned in somewhat randomly. Ideally, we'll either want a monster who is active on the field, defeat it, and then cause it to retreat to its nest. By the way, this is random, and you can really only fudge this chance a small bit using paintballs. Or, with some dumb luck, one of the nests will spawn in with a gold coloration instead of the usual stone color. Inside of these are procedurally generated nesting areas with enemy monsters, random free items, and at the end a monster nest you can pluck an egg from. Ideally, you want the gold-colored ones because the eggs from those tend to be either rarer or just higher quality. Naviru, our talking cartoon cat companion, joins us in the game's early hours and speaks on behalf of the player avatar, and he'll gauge the egg based on its weight and its smell, heavier and smellier eggs being the more ideal results. Then you can hatch the egg and get to see a cute, freshly hatched version of the baby monster, which then instantly ages up to its usable size. You can do this as much as you want, because at the tail end of Chapter 2, you unlock the Rite of Channeling, which lets you start playing Mad Scientist. Every monster has a 3x3 grid full of colored tokens, each acting as a gene in the monster's available gene pool. By matching these symbols and colors across rows and columns, you can increase the monster's strengths and elemental affinities. Yes, this gets increasingly complex as the game goes on, but it's aided in two major ways. For starters, the highest level of your party dictates the proper level of the party, and any monsters under this level threshold get big XP multipliers applied up until they're caught up, greatly reducing the amount of grinding necessary in order to make them competitive. Second, there's a combat speed multiplier and the ability to skip any and all repeated mid-battle cutscenes for your special attacks. This helps keep what is, admittedly, a little repetitious combat system fairly brisk all the way through. Now, if I had to issue complaint, and I do because I am me, it's just that. The combat can be repetitive, and there's no small amount of RNG in getting the monsters that you really want. I remember when I first entered into the snowfield, I lucked into getting a Lagombi very early in my time there, who was a mainstay in my party for, well, probably longer than it should have been. I like Lagombi, okay? So expect grinding in more than one way. And as said, the weapons aren't balanced super well. There's clear favoritism for certain families more than others, especially for the offensively minded sets. But ultimately, it's a very engaging RPG that I found myself enjoying all the way to the very end and then some. It's available right now on Steam and Nintendo Switch, so if you're a fan of Monster Hunter, there's no reason not to give it a whirl. I highly recommend it, and that's a final word on today's Snek Sweet. This has been the writer Snek, bringing to you another game for your consideration. If you liked today's episode, hit the like button so I know. Leave a comment down below. Have you played the Stories series yet? What's your favorite monstie? Mine's Ivory Legiacris. And if you want more like this 5 days a week, including NDX, Obscure Games, Snek Tech, and the Tomodachi Bros Review Podcast Season 2, coming soon, smash the subscribe and bell icon so you'll never miss a one. You never know what'll come next, and rest assured, I will see you there.